delighted that we have Beatrice Heuser with us this afternoon. As I'm sure many of you know, Beatrice is Professor at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow, and her work is extraordinarily impressive. It really combines the analytical and conceptual clarity of the best of political science writing with a deep sympathy and understanding for historical method and the tricky nature of historical sources. And she writes across a really wide range of subjects. Early work on the history of the Cold War, moving on to look at nuclear strategy, history of NATO, and then more recently a lot of really interesting material on strategy. So understanding and reading Clausewitz, a book then on strategy before Clausewitz, which is her most recent book, and a wider ranging study which looks at the evolution of strategy really from antiquity up to the present, which has been translated into French and German. And I gather that what we're going to get this evening presents some ideas of something which I hope will become a new book. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So without further ado, if we can hand over Beatrice. So I should add that we're going to have this paper in two segments. So we're going to take the first 20 minutes and then we'll have around 10 minutes of questions. And then Beatrice will move on with her second half, and then we'll also have another 10 minutes of questions. So do bear that in mind as you listen and as you want to formulate questions. So over to you, Beatrice.
Hello, and thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to do something which is going to be highly, highly experimental. So let's see whether this is going to work. I need your help on this one. This is, as I said, experimental in the sense that it brings in all of you, I hope all of your expertise. And I shall begin with my astonishment about the fact that a psychologist managed to write this entire book about how the bitter angels of our nature, and how violence supposedly became ever smaller or ever less over a long period of time, and has managed to go into this field and claim lots of things which were heavily disputed, but he was not an historian. I am not an expert on antiquity, and I'm really not an expert on most periods of history, which is why I need the collaborative historical approach. But I do want to bring real historians on board and not just psychologists on an experimental exploration on the relationship between compassion and war. You will see why in a moment, but I'll start with a simple definition of compassion, i.e. some sort of sympathetic pity and concern for the suffering of others. And there is interesting literature on this, which deals with the way in which in the past emotions have been used for political purpose and have been contained and have been manipulated. This is one of the points that I'm going to be homing in on, the question of whether, if you do find instances of compassion in particular periods of history where I'm going to argue that they were largely absent from war, whether if you do find such expressions, they are an exception, or whether they are a very instrumentalized usage of compassion, or whether they are something that simply questions the theory that I'm about to present to you. The theory, really empirically derived, basically starts with the assumption that there was very little compassion in warfare in antiquity and all the way up to the 15th century. So that's my first tentative empirical finding. Let's start with the question of what humans feel in the presence of suffering. And we might as well go back to the story of the Good Samaritan, which is that a lot of people would simply turn away because they wouldn't know what to do in a particular case of suffering. And that is pretty normal, in the sense that you can imagine that soldiers in the context of war coming across lots of civilians or prisoners of war have a choice between potentially investing a great amount of time and effort and resources in rescuing civilians or helping keep prisoners of war alive, or in fact turning away, turning the blind eye to the whole their suffering, because they simply have other things to do. There are so many other things to do, and it is very difficult in times of war to second forces to looking after prisoners, or making resources available to looking after them, or making resources available to feed civilians. And there might even be the great temptation to effect a mercy killing. Just to give an example of this, if you have somebody who's very heavily injured, how much are you going to expend on making sure that that person comes to safety, and that you're going to help them potentially survive if you think that that's a very unlikely situation in the first place. So how do people actually react to human suffering? And I think it's more than understandable that in many, many contexts, the more immediate reaction is to say, I really haven't got the resources, time, compassion, or anything for this. Nevertheless, one would wonder, one wants to know how soldiers feel about various situations in which they confront themselves. For example, how do they feel about killing an armed enemy in the heat of battle? I've talked to very peacefully disposed people who have been conscripted and had no intention of becoming soldiers, and who summed up that they would not want to kill anybody, but if somebody shot you, then you shoot back, and there was simply no choice in the matter. But how do you feel about disarmed, captured enemy soldiers? Again, there is this question of, are you going to invest a great amount of time and effort to keep them as prisoners, keep them alive? Yes, possibly, if there is the incentive that you can then ransom them, get somebody to pay to ransom them. If you kill them, there might be the consideration that the enemy will do the same thing to you next time. So there's a certain amount of concern about keeping that person alive, or keeping enemy soldiers alive, and respecting certain rules about this. But what about civilians? Again, are you really going to invest a lot of time to keep them alive? Or if there is a gain in this, you might want to turn them into useful slaves, again, hold them for ransom. There are many instances in ancient history where people were expelled from their cities, and thereby the people who expelled them, the soldiers who expelled them, could just shrug this off and say, well, they're no longer our problem, when the reality was that these people would be exposed to death by starvation, or exposure, or both, or dying of thirst. So this is a measure which in many contexts you can find very easily practiced, even if it is something that is completely against the current laws of war. It's another step to go and maltreat them deliberately. And that's quite different again from despoiling them and stealing from them. But there are different approaches that you can have, and we find all of those in antiquity. But in fact, this idea of investing a great amount of time and effort to keep them alive, we see really only in combination of turning them into useful slaves. So let's start with ancient Greece, and I very much welcome any comments from any of my audience here, if they know better about these periods and if they have more examples in mind. So, on the whole, prisoners of war seem to have been killed mostly. Besieged towns seem to have been allowed to surrender and the populations to move out, but that would still mean that they could be facing death by famine and exposure. After the capture of a besieged town that did not surrender, the pattern seems to be, and I'm basing myself mainly on the work of Hans van Wees, that men were killed or else enslaved, that women were raped, and generally women and children were not killed but enslaved. On the whole, according to Hans van Wees, the one rule that was always obeyed was that you would not kill women, but that you would enslave them. There are occasional acts of mercy, and I wonder whether we find them in sources because they are so very exceptional rather than because they're the rule, that they are praised as something quite out of the ordinary. So the famous story about Alexander being so generous with Darius's women's folk and letting them survive and not enslaving them. And this is exactly something where I need other real classicists to comment on what I'm saying. Defeated insurgents were on the whole killed. We know that this is against the backdrop of a much higher tolerance of violence, a much greater extent of violence. So we know that Spartans chose whether or not to kill their children or actually let them grow up. And we know that slaves could be killed by their masters and abused in many different ways. Again, I've had colleagues tell me, yes, but there is an exception. There's this Euripides Trojan women. My question to this is a play like that really, was it at the time intended to make people sympathetic and change their ways? Or was the whole idea of theatre in the ancient Greek world one of this catharsis where you walked away feeling somehow elated, but not necessarily something that was supposed to make you feel that you want to change the situation? And here is my proposal to you, that in the Greek world, you don't really have, particularly in the context of warfare, much compassion, if any. There was much more importantly, there was the desire not to offend the gods. Because whenever you look out for who's to be spared, the rules are that you should spare priests, that you should spare people taking refuge in or around temples, sanctuaries or holy groves. So Thucydides gives us a story about in the Peloponnesian War where a crowd of people take refuge in a holy grove and they were massacred. And this seems to be terrible, not so much because these people who were civilians, I think, were massacred. It's mainly terrible because they were massacred in a holy grove. And then pilgrims, but again, pilgrims, they were travelers to holy sites, people on their way to consult the Oracle of Delphi. Or there were people, it was wrong to waylay and kill people who were going to the Olympic Games because there was an Olympic truce. And then there was, of course, the messenger whom you mustn't kill. So on the whole, there seems to have been this preoccupation with not offending the gods, rather than showing compassion to people who were unarmed or in some way not your adversary. Do correct me afterwards if you feel that this is a misrepresentation. Let's look at Rome before Christianity. Again, you have a pattern of prisoners being killed and occasional acts of mercy extolled as exceptional. You have the siege of Alesia, for example, where the non-combatants that were expelled by Vercingetorix, you will remember that Alesia was surrounded by a wall, but then there was another a siege wall by the Romans, so there was a no man's land between them. Vercingetorix expelled the civilians because they couldn't feed them in his encampment of Alesia, and the Romans didn't allow them to pass their own siege wall, and therefore they were starving miserably in no man's land in between. And after the capture of a besieged town, you had still got the general pattern that men were killed or else enslaved, that women were raped, and that women and children were not killed but enslaved. What about hostages? Hostages could be, there are instances of hostages being killed. There are defeated insurgents would be killed, very definitely. But again, the level of cruelty that was acceptable was even extended to Rome's own society. You know about this, the terrible punishment of decimation of disobedient soldiers, where every 10 soldiers drawn by lot would be killed. We know that there was a tradition that fathers had the right to decide on whether to kill their children or not. We're not so sure that this was actually done very often, but still there was the expectation that this could be done. As we know, there was the expectation that masters could do whatever they liked with their slaves. So there's a high tolerance of violence within the society itself. I think there are signs that humanitarian views were creeping in. So Cicero famously said that there was a limit to retribution and punishment. And in war, in context of war, it was important to spare those who have not been cruel and monstrous in their warfare. So there is this, and Cicero on the whole has got many, many views that we find very acceptable and very much a guideline for us today. But with perhaps the exception of a small tradition of this sort, I would still put it to you that compassion wasn't great in pre-Christian Rome, where there was, again, much more of a concern with following legal procedure and following rules. Their own gods were seen as spiteful and vindictive. The important thing seemed to be to follow in war official law, the legal procedures of law, rather than being compassionate towards adversaries. Of course, we have many instances in which adversaries, once they came to an arrangement, were then accepted into their own army, were accepted as allies, were by and by then even accepted into the Roman body politic. But crucially, one gets the impression that it's not primarily out of compassion, but out of calculated gains for both sides, a win-win situation. Roman religion changed, particularly since from Augustus to the end of the empire, with this interesting transformation of the Olympus, the Roman Olympus, into particularly a father-son story of Jupiter and Hercules, God the Father and God the Son, which would then be an interesting precedent for the Christian configuration. But you also have the imported religions, of course, with Mithraism and Judaism and Christianity, of which we really can't say, as far as I can tell, that Mithraism was a very compassionate religion. By contrast, it was Judaism that introduced some form of compassion. And very interestingly, it's of course that important line that we've inherited in the Christian religion from Judaism, the idea of the loving one's neighbor as oneself. And very, very interestingly, a group of Dutch archaeologists has found that the first catacombs, the catacombs are interesting in Rome because they are a sign of a community taking care of weaker members. For a very long time, these were attributed primarily to the Christians having compassion. They would bury their compatriots, or their fellow Christians in catacombs if the Christians couldn't afford to do so themselves. Sorry, but in fact it was the Jews who did this first in Rome, and the Christians who copied it. So fascinatingly, the Jews in Rome started this tradition. I will slightly fast forward now. So copied by Christianity. When Christianity became the state religion, a number of things were abolished. So you had the abolition of crucifixion, circus games, lethal circus games, and even the attempt to forbid enslavement of fellow Christians. But in fact, John Gillingham shows that de facto the imprisonment, the enslavement of women and children, even Christian women and children, was still practiced in the 12th century. Incidentally, if anybody would like these slides, I'm finding it difficult to send them, but the references I'm very happy to share. Now, interestingly, the first rules or ordinances of war seem to be going back to early Christian Rome. There are faint hints of these in the Codex Theodosianus, which in a very traditional way protects above all religious sites. So again, the concern with not angering the gods, in this case a Christian god, it was outlawing the pillaging of ecclesiastical property. And you do have the earliest military ordinances I've come across in the 6th century in East Roman Emperor Maurice's Strategicon, which lists some things which the troops are not supposed to do. You do also get it in the West when you have, in fact, sorry, this should be 1500, around 500. Sorry, typical mistake. So sorry, make it around 500 when the Clovis, the Christian tells his troops, much in the Roman tradition, that they should not pillage the sanctuaries of St. Martin, in Tours, because they belong to St. Martin. So they can steal anywhere else, they can get food from peasants anywhere else, but not in Tours. And they must also spare anything near that belongs to the Church of St. Hilaire in Poitiers, because it belongs to some church property. So that's very much almost the sort of old Greek thinking and the Roman thinking of we must not interfere with the property of the church. But then you come to the Carolingian capitularies, where increasingly systematically there is the attempt to say, do not interfere with any peasants, do leave them alone, don't despoil them, because of course armies were living off the land and it was very difficult for them to feed themselves other than by taking food from the peasantry in the area. And yet from Charlemagne onwards, we find that kings try to tell their forces to come with enough food so that they don't have to do this. The church was very interested in this. I'm speeding up a little bit. So from the late 10th century, you have the Pax Dei movement, which is in a way trying to replicate the Pax Romana or revive the Pax Romana, trying to make the military order not interfere with the peasantry. And you have this wonderful list of commitments supposedly to be made by knights, which according to the Bishop of Beauvais should promise not to attract a cleric or monk, not to take his ox, cow, pig, sheep, but also to leave the peasantry alone, and not to set fire to buildings, not to attack merchants or pilgrims, not to attack noble women. Interestingly, noble women, the others seem to be okay. We have interesting spreading of the idea that you should have peace at home during a crusade or a king's war. And there's an interesting, very early ordinance by Frederick I Barbarossa in his campaign within his own territory, which is, in this case, northern Italy, the famous Lombard campaign, where he ordered there shouldn't be any pillaging of churches, arson, theft, or there shouldn't be any women in the camp. Typically, when Milan surrendered to Frederick Barbarossa, what happened was that there was a big procedure of clemency, a big show of clemency made. And in the interest of time, I'll just tell you what it says here, that basically the emperor showed mercy because the Milanese agreed to have through the procession to walk with bare feet and with crosses on their and poor garments, and to admit that they'd been wrong in rising up against the emperor. The emperor showed him clemency and mercy, but this was a standard procedure anyway when a city had surrendered. The only difference here being this was more mercy than normal because these had been rebels. And yet, on the whole, the rule was if a city surrendered in medieval times, you should show them mercy. You have the contrasting situation in which King David I of Scotland, around the same time, invades England and puts towns there to fire and sword, and interferes in very horrible ways with the local population because they hadn't surrendered. So the brutality there shows no compassion at all. In the attempts to recreate the Pax Romana, locally sovereigns tried to, within their country, to establish peace and to stop their barons from feuding, a very long process which seemed to work out only very gradually. So you had Emperor Frederick I, for example, drawing up a Landfrieden order, which was similar to the Anglo-Saxon concept of the king's peace domestically. So on the whole, monarchs tried to enforce peace at home, but not necessarily abroad. So there is a whole series of ordinances from the 100 Years' Wars and the Anglo-Scottish Wars, on which have worked various colleagues, Anne Curry and Rory Cox and others. And they have found that there is a pattern in all these ordinances to say you must protect clergy, you must protect peasants, you must protect merchants and travelers. But in fact, only in your own lands, on your own side, to which this cathedral, the Abbey at Melrose in the borders of Scotland is testimony, because when the English forces moved across the border and cities or towns in Scotland did not surrender with them, abbeys were burnt down and destroyed, and towns were put to the sword, just in the way in which King David had destroyed towns in northern England when he walked into northern England. So this whole idea that you should protect somebody, that there were certain categories of people with whom you should have compassion, whom you should protect, it seems until the 15th century is really something that only applies to your own side. And this is my cliffhanger to making a little break here and to inviting comments on what I've said before I move on to part 2.
Okay, well, there's your invitation for asking some questions.
Any classicists who might comment on this and say this is a total perversion of reality, and there were many exceptions and they weren't exceptions, they were the rule, great signs of compassion, etc. Do tell me.